Hi, I'm Scott Folk with Apex Tactical Specialties. Today we're here to install the Apex Duty Carry Shield Kit into the Smith & Wesson M&P Shield. Let's go ahead and unbag the kit so we can see what's in the packaging. First we've got our bag of springs. This contains a Sear spring, a trigger return spring, and a shield specific slave pin. This is a smaller diameter than the slave pin for the standard M&Ps, so it is specific to the shield only. Next item in the kit is the Ultimate Striker Block kit that comes with an Ultimate Striker Block, a Striker Block spring, and the Talon Tactical rear sight tool. Final component of the kit is going to be the Apex fully machined Sear. This is the same Sear we put in the M&Ps and works just as well in the shield itself. A couple of quick notes before we get into the disassembly of the pistol. The takedown lever itself specifically has a little tab on the end of it. You can see here. That tab specifically locks into a notch on the locking block. So when you go to disassemble it, there's a little hole it has to be removed from, and that's very critical to make sure you don't damage it when you disassemble it. Another thing to look at when you are disassembling your shield is the trigger pivot pin, the trigger bar pivot pin, and the safety pin. We've seen some of these pins walk out, which can make disassembly of the gun difficult and actually damage the frame if you're not careful. So check these two pins and make sure they are seated pretty close to flush, if not slightly below flush, on both sides before you proceed. To disassemble the shield, first thing we're going to do is check the gun is unloaded. Demonstrate it's unloaded. I'm going to use a pin punch or something alike, and I'm going to use the yellow takedown lever inside the frame, just like the M&Ps, and put it into the disconnect position. Once I've done so, I'll take the takedown lever down, rotate it 90 degrees till it stops. At that point, I'll pull the slide back and take it off the frame. A minute ago, I described a notch in the locking block for the takedown lever to be removed from. If you look closely in here, you can see the notch where the tab goes through it. So be cautious that when you remove the takedown lever, it comes out of that hole. You don't want to wiggle it too hard or turn it all the way around like most people do with the M&Ps. So to remove the locking block, we're going to rotate it up at about 10-15 degrees above the frame, and we're going to work on wiggling it out a little bit at a time. Once it comes free from the side, you'll know because it'll basically just pop right out. At that point, you still want to maintain that about 10-15 degree angle as you remove the takedown lever from the frame. We'll go ahead and set that aside. Next thing we'll do is set the frame on our block, and we'll go ahead and pound out the two frame pins. The one in the Sear housing block and the one in the locking block. These pins should be removed right to left, and they will be reinstalled left to right. The third and final pin to remove is the trigger pivot pin itself. We're going to take our pin punch and press that pin. It should push out with semi-minimal pressure, and we can pull it out the opposite side. Once that's out, I can grab the Sear housing block. If I can't pull it up easily, I can take my 1/8 inch roll pin punch and squeeze it in between the frame and the frame rail and kind of wiggle it up so we can get moving on it. Once that begins to come out, I'm going to pull the trigger and hold it down. At that point, the Sear housing block can come out of the frame. We'll set the frame aside for now and we'll work with the Sear housing block first. The first thing you'll notice on the shield Sear housing block is every shield so far that we've seen has a thumb safety attached to it. That thumb safety is removed, but you have to actually bend it slightly as you remove it. To do so, we're going to drop the bottom area down where the hole is, and we're going to pivot it around the back of the block and set that aside. When doing so, you need to be cautious of the thumb safety retainer plunger and the spring. Those pieces articulate in the Sear housing block and can easily be dislodged and removed by accident. To remove the Sear, we're going to take our 1/16 inch punch and we're going to press the Sear pin all the way through. Pull the Sear pin out and set it aside. At that point, I'm going to put my thumb on top of the Sear pin, remove the pin punch, relieve the tension on the Sear, then I can pick the Sear up and set that aside. I'll turn the block over, tap it on the table, and you'll see first the Sear plunger comes out, and a little bit more, and the spring should pop out. If it doesn't, take your 1/16 inch punch, go into the notch, and just kind of fish that spring out. You'll notice that most of the factory Sear springs are painted yellow. That's to indicate which spring they're using. So we'll set that spring aside with the Sear. We're going to go ahead and break into our kit and then begin installation. When we go to install the Sear and Sear spring, the first thing I'll do is take our new Sear spring. I'll take a bit of white lithium grease and put a little dab in the end of the spring. I'll take the Sear plunger itself and put it into the spring, and that grease will act as an adhesive to hold the plunger in place. At this point, we can put the plunger and spring back into the Sear housing block, into their little hole. I'll take the new Apex fully machined Sear, set it on top. I'll have my Sear pin in hand. I'll press the Sear down and engage the pin through the Sear all the way. Once that Sear pin is in, I'll use the yellow takedown lever and check the articulation of the Sear and make sure it looks good. At that point, the Sear housing block is reassembled. To reinstall the thumb safety, you'll notice the opposite side of where the thumb safety paddle is, so over here, you have a little piece that comes down at a 90-degree angle. That locks into the notch on this side of the Sear housing block. So when we go to reassemble it, we want to take that piece, drop it into that notch, and then roll the thumb safety around the Sear housing block back into position. I normally will place the thumb safety in the lowered position when I go to reassemble the frame. We'll set that piece aside for now and move on to the rest of the frame. I have my frame here with just the locking block, trigger, and trigger bar in it. So we'll go ahead and remove the locking block. Since I already pulled the pins, it's just a simple matter of pulling it out. At the same time, you saw my slide lock lever pop out as well. At this point, we can grab the trigger bar and pull the trigger bar and trigger return spring out of the frame. To remove the trigger return spring from the trigger bar, it normally sits in this position. If you'll notice, the opening on the trigger return spring is in the up position as it's installed from the factory. This is critical to make sure that it doesn't pop off during use. To remove the spring, I'm going to roll the spring around. I'll roll it out of the trigger, pick it up, and disconnect it from the trigger bar. We'll set that spring aside with all of our other factory parts, and I'll get into my bag and get out the trigger return spring and the shield slave pin. To reinstall the Apex spring, you'll notice that it has a large and a small loop on it. The small loop goes on the trigger bar, the large loop goes into the trigger itself. So starting with the spring, pointing away from the trigger, basically following the trigger bar, by hooking the small end into the hole on the trigger bar. Sometimes they can be a little tight, but tighter is a good thing. Once we get that locked on, I can roll it around into the trigger and push it into position. And you'll notice that the opening on the trigger bar, the trigger return spring loop, is in the up position. At this point, I can use my shield slave pin. There's one end with a bevel and one end with a flat. I'll take the beveled end in first. At the same time, I'm going to engage the trigger return spring with that pin. Sometimes you may need to take a small screwdriver in here and pull the spring up a little to allow the slave pin to go all the way through. Once I have the pin in, I'll grab both sides and I'll articulate the trigger bar to make sure everything is in and seated properly. As you can see, the spring is extending as it should and returning the way it's designed to. Now it's time to reassemble the frame. I'll take my trigger bar and trigger assembly, I'll drop that back into the frame. I'll take my locking block and my slide lock lever and I'll reassemble those as well by pressing the slide lock lever into the side of the locking block. One thing to note on the locking blocks is these two bosses at the front, one here and one here. Those two pieces lock into the frame and allow the locking block to slide back into position. So don't push it straight down, you want to get those into their notch and slide them into position. Another thing of note is the trigger body itself and the locking block tend to be very tightly fitted in some of these guns. So one thing you may need to do is hold the trigger body and kind of wiggle it side to side as you put the locking block in place. That'll allow it to seat itself into position. As you can see, it slid right down. At this point, I'll pull the trigger to take as much tension as I can off the trigger return spring. And I'm going to do my best to visually align the slave pin in the trigger pivot pin hole. In some cases you can get it perfectly aligned, sometimes it takes a little bit more work. So at this point we'll take the trigger pivot pin, which is the only solid pin we've pulled out of the frame so far that has a little head on it. We'll go in from the left side and we'll try to push the slave pin out as we press that pin through. Now if it doesn't go in right away, what I do is I'll take and bear a straight down pressure on it while I do my best to align the actual pin from the opposite side. There we go. It pushes down, the slave pin will come out, and at that point all I have to do is final seat the trigger pivot pin either by hand or give it a little light tap with a soft hammer. Now we'll go ahead and reinstall the Sear housing block. The best method we've found for that is to pull the trigger to get the trigger bar up in the highest position possible. We'll take the Sear housing block and we will engage the trigger extension, this little piece back here on the trigger bar, into the Sear housing block. Sometimes you have to wiggle it around from the side to kind of get it into position. Once that's in, the Sear housing block can come forward and be slid down into position. You should see the Sear housing block pinhole is aligned all the way through at this point. Now that I have the Sear housing block back into position, I'm going to need to reinstall the coil roll pin. Now this can be a little tricky because you have a piece of stamped sheet metal between the frame and the Sear housing block that needs to be aligned. My method for doing that is to take my 1/8 inch roll pin punch from the right side to the left, push it all the way through the Sear housing block as a slave pin, and that's going to line up my thumb safety with my Sear housing block. At this point I'll take the pin, I'll pull my pin punch back a bit, and I'll start inserting my coil roll pin into the frame. At this point I can then tap with a Delrin tip or soft tip hammer that pin into the frame, which will overtake and push my pin out. At this point I'll put it back on the block and I'll continue with my polymer hammer until it's nearly flush. I'll take the roll pin punch again and seat the pin just below flush on both sides. We'll do the same thing up front, but there's no need to use the slave pin, so I'll just set the pin into the frame, push it as far as I can, then I'll go ahead and tap it down. Again, in this case, just below flush. So that pin is now completely installed. Now I have my coil roll pins installed. I'll take my takedown lever and reinstall it. You'll remember the little tab sticking out of it that I mentioned before. That needs to go into the notch on the locking block without being damaged. So my method for doing that, you can see on the frame the little notch that locks into. At this point, I'll take my takedown lever and I'll align that little tab into the notch. I'll push it straight in. I'll engage the other side in the same manner. until it seats. At that point I can roll it all the way down into the takedown position. My frame is reassembled and complete at this point, and we'll jump right into the slide. In the slide, all we have to do is remove the rear sight and install the new ultimate striker block. So the first thing we'll do is we'll go ahead and take out the barrel and recoil assembly. This just gets them out of our way for later on. I'll take a 1/16 inch Allen wrench, and in this case I will completely remove the rear sight screw. The reason I remove the screw entirely is that I don't want to lose it or damage the slide when tapping the sight out. I've had sights where the screw would, as you're tapping it, the screw would pop back down and damage the slide. So to prevent damage, we remove the screw and set it aside where we can find it later. I'll take my slide over to the vise, and I'll use, in this case I'm using a piece of leather in my vise, but you can use a piece of polymer or a piece of anything that's not marring. You can even use business cards or some cardboard paper to hold the slide. It just prevents the slide from going anywhere and prevents damage. I'll take my tape wrap punch, set it into the dovetail, and I'll tap the rear sight out all the way off the edge. At this point, I'll keep the sight on here. I'll pull my punch out. I'll put my hand over the top as I remove the sight. The reason for that is underneath the sight is a washer and a spring that controls the striker block assembly. Most of the new shields have this new polymer washer. Some of them have the stainless washer, just like the M&P has. Either one doesn't matter too much. We'll set those two aside, and I'll use my pin punch and just push the striker block up out of the frame. We'll set those pieces aside and we'll open up our third package. Remove the Talon tactical tool, which we will need in a minute. Remove the striker block itself, which you'll notice has a nice polish on the end. And the Apex Ultimate Striker Block spring that is slightly lighter than the factory. When dealing with the polymer version of the striker block washer, it will be attached to the spring with a little tip on it. So pull the spring off, set that one aside. You'll notice that the Apex spring doesn't perfectly engage, it doesn't perfectly fit on like the factory does. That's okay, it doesn't matter at this point, so we'll set those two pieces down here. I'll take the striker block itself, put the domed shiny side down and drop it straight into the slide. At this point I'll take the new Apex striker block spring, I'll set that on top, and then I'll take the factory polymer washer, I'll set that on top and make sure the little tip, if you can see here this little tip, I'm going to engage it into the spring itself before I press it down. From there, I'll take my Talon tactical tool from the right side of the slide to the left, and I'll cover that washer and push that all the way across. At this point, I'll pull this out of the vise so you can see. At this point, with the Talon tool in, I'll press on the striker block to make sure it's functioning properly. It should articulate up and down smoothly without any real interruptions. If it's really hard to press on, you may have gotten the spring sideways or the washer a little out of whack. So at that point, if that's the case, remove the Talon tool, reset everything, and try it again. I'll take my factory rear sight, and I'll use that sight to push the Talon tool out of the slide as I press the sight back in. In this case, I'm going to again use my Delrin tip punch that won't mar the material, and I'll tap the sight in while holding the Talon tool and letting it slide through my fingers. This allows the rear sight to overtake the plunger and put it back in position. I'm going to visually center the rear sight, pretty close there. And of course, if you're going to be very precise about it, you'll want to get a square, use calipers, and measure between the sides of the slide, and the sides of the sight to get it mechanically centered. After doing this, you will want to go out and re-zero the gun and make sure it is zeroed according to your needs. I'll take my 16th inch Allen wrench, I'll put the screw back on it, and I'll reinstall that screw into the rear sight, and I'll torque it down. It's not unacceptable to use Loctite if you prefer to keep that screw in. Most of the screws come with a little bit of Loctite from the factory, and they tend to hold in pretty well. Now that we have the slide reassembled, we'll go ahead and put the barrel back into it and the recoil assembly, and we'll put it back on the frame. When I reassemble the frame, I want to make sure that the takedown lever is in the down position before I put the slide on. Once I've got that done, I should have my trigger pull a lot smoother. So, let's check out our trigger pull weight here after the fact. Right at 6 pounds almost. Well, 5 3/4 pounds. Try one more time. Five and a half. I'd say we're right about 5.5 pounds on the final trigger pull weight. We've removed most of the grit and crunch from the trigger pull and cleaned up the trigger, so we're right at about the 5.5 pound mark.